In the far reaches of Tasmania lies a place where silence once screamed louder than chains. Port Arthur, a prison built not just to punish bodies but to break souls. Here, convicts from across the British Empire faced isolation so deep, it blurred the line between madness and death. Before we step into the haunting ruins that still whisper at night, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more true stories from the world's darkest prisons. Because this is where the ghosts of justice still linger. Tasmania, 1833. The British Empire was growing fast, but so were its criminals. London streets overflowed with thieves, pickpockets, and debtors. Prisons in England were bursting at the seams, and the Crown needed a place to send those it deemed unworthy of redemption. Their solution lay across the world, in a remote, mist-covered island off the coast of Australia. Port Arthur. Port Arthur wasn't just a prison. It was a machine of order, obedience, and silence. Built on a peninsula surrounded by cold, shark-infested waters, the site was chosen for one purpose: no escape. The only land route was through a narrow strip called the Eagle Hawk Neck, patrolled by guards and savage dogs trained to attack anything that moved. For the convicts who arrived here, it might as well have been the end of the earth. When the first prisoners stepped off the boats, the air was thick with the smell of damp timber and iron. The overseers stood waiting, wearing the stiff uniforms of the British Empire, stoic, unblinking, ready to impose order on chaos. The convicts, many of whom had committed petty crimes, quickly learned that their past misdeeds were nothing compared to what awaited them here. Port Arthur was designed to reform through pain. Prisoners were divided into classes based on behavior. The well-behaved worked in open areas, while troublemakers were confined in darkness and silence. Work began before sunrise: timber cutting, stone quarrying, shipbuilding, endless labor that broke the body while isolation shattered the mind. The settlement quickly grew into more than a prison. It became a full penal colony, with workshops, factories, even a church. But this was no ordinary church. Inside, prisoners were separated by high wooden partitions, unable to see each other or even speak. Worship, in theory, was meant to save their souls. In practice, it deepened their solitude. Those who refused to obey faced punishments that blurred the line between discipline and cruelty. The lash was common, 25 to 100 strokes for defiance. But by the mid-1800s, reformers claimed whipping was barbaric, and a new experiment began: the silent system. Under this system, prisoners were forbidden to speak, ever. Meals were taken in silence. Work was done in silence. Even their faces were hidden beneath hooded masks when they left their cells. The goal was psychological control, to force prisoners into submission through complete sensory deprivation. But what the architects of reform didn't predict was madness. Men began to lose their grip on reality. Some talked to themselves just to hear a voice. Others screamed in the night, clawing at the walls of their cells. There were suicide attempts, hallucinations, and breakdowns, all under the watchful eyes of guards who wrote everything down in meticulous reports. Yet, for the British Empire, Port Arthur was a success story. It proved that even the most rebellious men could be tamed, if the prison was cruel enough. As the colony expanded, the settlement developed a dark rhythm. New convicts arrived, old ones died, and the system kept turning. The surrounding forest echoed with the sound of axes, saws, and chains. At night, the wind carried the cries of men who would never see freedom again. To the outside world, Port Arthur was a symbol of order and discipline. To those inside, it was a living nightmare. By 1840, the site held over 1,000 convicts, soldiers, and civilians. Some were hardened criminals. Others just boys, sent here for stealing bread or clothes. The British Empire claimed it was reformation. But for those trapped within the stone walls, it was a place of silence, despair, and ghosts. They called it hell on earth. And soon, even the guards began to believe it. The year is 1842. The British authorities at Port Arthur had grown tired of the old ways of punishment: the flogging, the beatings, the daily violence that seemed to fuel rebellion instead of reform. What they had yet to grasp, though, was that they were breeding a far more insidious form of suffering. A form that couldn't be seen, but would forever alter the very men trapped within these walls. It was in this year that the silent system was fully implemented, a drastic shift that transformed Port Arthur from a prison into a mind-bending experiment in human endurance. The British believed this new form of punishment would break the spirits of the men who entered their gates. But it was also an experiment in silence itself. A silence so complete that it could crack the mind in ways no physical punishment ever could. Inmates who had once been allowed to speak during certain work hours were now muzzled in a much darker way. Guards used a series of signals and hand gestures to communicate with each other, But there was no human conversation. No voices echoing in the halls. No laughter. No complaints. Only the relentless sound of chains dragging across stone floors, the clanking of iron doors closing, and the occasional creaking of old wood. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement for days, sometimes weeks, without a single word spoken to them. Their meals were handed to them without a sound, slid through small openings in their cells. Even their time in the yard was governed by silence. This wasn't a mere punishment, this was a psychological assault. One of the most haunting aspects of Port Arthur was its design, a sprawling complex with long, cold corridors and small, dark cells. The isolation was total. There was no chance for connection, for camaraderie, or even for a passing word of comfort. Even the prison chaplain, sent to guide their souls to redemption, communicated with the inmates from behind a partition, unable to speak directly with them. The silence wasn't just a punishment. It was a weapon. It was used to break the will, to strip away identity, to reduce the human spirit to a mere echo in the void. Inside these walls, the effects of isolation became terrifyingly apparent. Prisoners who had once walked proudly in their early days at the prison began to lose themselves. Some cowered in the corners of their cells, refusing to move. Others began speaking to invisible companions, creating entire worlds in their heads just to stave off the crushing solitude. But many fell into something far darker: madness. There are reports of men who would scream for hours, not in rage but in sheer desperation. Others would bang their heads against the stone walls, hoping for any response, any sound, to break the suffocating silence. These men would sometimes be brought out of their cells, their faces pale and gaunt from the months, even years, spent alone. Yet even as their bodies were restored, their minds were forever broken. These men would never again be able to reintegrate into society. The damage done in these solitary cells was irreversible. For those prisoners who did endure the isolation, there was the looming presence of the dreaded dark cells. These were solitary confinement cells with no windows, no light, and no way to tell whether it was day or night. These were not just places for punishment, but tools for breaking spirits. A man could be locked inside one of these cells for months, surviving only on water and bread, with the oppressive darkness and silence wrapping around him like a shroud. Port Arthur's officials believed this method of silence and isolation would reform the prisoners, making them better men. But the truth was far darker. It made them hollowed-out shells of human beings, shattered beyond recognition. The prison's medical reports from the era describe men raving in the dark corners of their cells, their voices becoming incomprehensible as they whispered to no one. And what did this achieve? It didn't breed remorse. It didn't breed gratitude. It bred terror. It turned men into shadows of themselves, too afraid to even look another convict in the eye. Some men, as they left Port Arthur, were never truly free. The prison didn't just haunt their past, it haunted their very souls. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this system was that those who survived it became an odd reflection of the men they had once been. They had been broken by the system, yes, but in a way they also became part of it. The cycle of isolation and silence created a collective trauma that would haunt the entire penal colony. The guards who ran Port Arthur were not untouched by the system they enforced. Some, while perhaps well-meaning in their own eyes, were drawn into the same cold, emotionless world as the prisoners. The more the silent system took hold, the less humanity was visible on both sides of the bars. Some reports from the time hint at the unsettling toll this took on the guards. Men who had once believed in the righteousness of the British Empire's mission of reformation found themselves questioning their own roles in the horror. By the mid-1800s, the psychological effects of this system were impossible to ignore. A few progressive thinkers began to argue that the silent system was deeply flawed and inhumane. But by the time they spoke out, Port Arthur had already become a place that existed far beyond any notion of reform. It had become a monument to despair. By the mid-1800s, Port Arthur had become a symbol of the British Empire's attempt to instill order and discipline through fear. But as the years wore on, cracks began to appear in the prison's imposing structure. The system that had once seemed infallible was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own brutality. The convicts, many of whom had endured unimaginable horrors, began to push back against their captors. And as the prison's population grew, the cracks widened, leading to one of the most daring escape attempts in Australian history. In 1847, the authorities at Port Arthur were forced to confront a growing issue. The prison's reputation was no longer one of strict discipline, but of psychological devastation. The system had broken far too many men, leaving the once elite facility in shambles. Stories of madness, despair, and broken spirits reached the ears of the public. What had once been an island of punishment had become a ticking time bomb. As the number of convicts swelled, so did their desire for freedom. Men who had spent years in solitude or under the harshest conditions had their spirits tested and broken, but in some, a fierce fire remained, a desire to escape no matter the cost. The British Empire had underestimated the human will to survive and break free, even in the face of such oppression. Port Arthur's remote location, isolated from the mainland by the treacherous waters of the Tasman Sea, made escape seem impossible. The guards, stationed on the surrounding cliffs and along the Eagle Hawk Neck, had been carefully chosen for their efficiency and loyalty. The iron gates, the watchtowers, and the dense forests made it nearly impossible for anyone to get past the walls without being caught. But there was one flaw that the authorities had overlooked: the guards could only watch so much. The very system that had been designed to break the spirit of the convicts had also created a bond among them, a bond born out of shared suffering. The prisoners began to whisper among themselves, and soon a plan began to take shape. For years, escape attempts had been made, and many had ended in failure. Some convicts tried to scale the prison walls, others attempted to swim across the freezing waters, but all were caught and punished. However, as Port Arthur's grip on its prisoners weakened, the spirit of rebellion grew stronger. A few daring souls began to work together in secret, digging tunnels, gathering tools, and plotting an escape so bold that it would become the stuff of legend. The most famous escape attempt came in 1848, when a group of 5 convicts managed to break out of the prison's high-security area. They had spent months secretly digging a tunnel under the prison walls, using only the most basic tools. The tunnel led to a dense thicket of trees beyond the prison's perimeter. In the dead of night, the convicts made their move. They crawled through the narrow, dirt-filled tunnel, emerging on the other side covered in sweat and fear. They were free. For a brief moment, the world beyond the island seemed possible again. But their freedom came at a cost. The convicts had to cross the Eagle Hawk Neck, a strip of land where guards patrolled mercilessly. Still, with nothing left to lose, the 5 men pressed on, creeping through the underbrush, barely breathing. But they had underestimated the power of the British Empire's surveillance. The escape was discovered almost immediately. In a desperate bid to escape their fate, the convicts scattered, hoping that the wild landscape would give them a chance. Unfortunately, the harsh conditions, the bitter cold, the dangerous terrain, and the ever-watchful eyes of the guards, quickly closed in on them. One by one, the convicts were recaptured, some having made it only a few miles from the prison gates. However, their escape sent a shockwave through the prison. The authorities had thought their control over the island was absolute, but the escape proved otherwise. It exposed the cracks in the system, and soon, Port Arthur's reputation as an impenetrable fortress began to falter. The British Empire was forced to acknowledge that even its most carefully designed penal colonies could not keep the human spirit chained forever. As the years went on, more escapes followed, though none as daring as the 1848 attempt. Some were successful for short periods, but most were quickly caught. Still, these escapes were a clear sign that Port Arthur's dominance was slipping. Prisoners who once feared their captors now saw the possibility of freedom, and with that hope came even more rebellious acts. In 1853, after years of mounting public pressure and dwindling resources, the British government decided to shut down Port Arthur. The prison, which had once been the centerpiece of the penal system in the British Empire, was abandoned. By the time the last convicts were removed, Port Arthur had held over 12,500 men and women, each one a story of suffering, endurance, and for many, madness. When Port Arthur was finally shut down in 1877, the world moved on. The prison's isolation, its harsh discipline, and its disturbing psychological toll on the men who had been held there slowly became a forgotten chapter in history. But for the survivors, the men who had walked its halls, worked its quarries, and been broken by its silence, the prison would never truly leave them. And even after the last stone was turned, Port Arthur's ghost would live on. The years following the closure of the penitentiary were marked by gradual decay. The buildings that once stood as symbols of British power and control began to crumble, worn down by time and the relentless force of nature. But something else was happening at Port Arthur too. While the prison's physical structure deteriorated, its eerie influence remained, like a stain that could never be fully washed away. It wasn't until the early 20th century that Port Arthur began to receive any significant attention once again. In 1927, the Tasmanian government made the decision to preserve the site. Its historical significance was undeniable, and with the rise of tourism and interest in colonial history, Port Arthur was open to the public as a historical landmark. But what had once been a symbol of punishment and suffering now became something else entirely, a macabre attraction. Visitors to Port Arthur, who once came with an understanding of the horrors that had taken place there, were now walking through the remnants of a haunted prison, their footsteps echoing on the cracked stone floors. But for some, the ghosts of Port Arthur weren't just the stuff of history, they were very much alive. Many who visited the site reported strange feelings of unease, odd sounds in the dead of night, and unexplained cold spots in the air. By the 1960s, stories began to surface of paranormal activity, whispers from the past that refused to stay buried. Tour guides, both local and foreign, spoke of strange happenings. Visitors would hear footsteps following them in the dark, or a feeling of being watched, only to turn around and find no one there. Some claimed they saw shadowy figures moving through the ruins, their faces obscured by the tattered remnants of old prison uniforms. And more chillingly, some said they heard faint, disembodied cries echoing from the long-abandoned cells. For those who had lived through the brutality of Port Arthur, the prison was more than just a haunted site, it was a permanent scar. Many of the prisoners who had survived the harsh treatment, the silence, the punishments were never the same. Their lives after leaving Port Arthur were spent trying to reconcile the trauma they had endured, but the psychological effects were far-reaching. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Port Arthur is how it shaped Australia's justice system. When it was built, it was designed to be the ultimate tool of reform. The belief was that by isolating the criminal, forcing them into silence, and breaking their will, the state could return them to society as changed men. But the reality was much darker. Port Arthur became an incubator for madness, not reform. And as Australia moved into the 20th century, it became clear that the cruelty of the penal system had left an indelible mark on the country's approach to incarceration. In the years following the closure of Port Arthur, Australia gradually shifted its views on criminal justice. The brutal tactics of the past were increasingly seen as inhumane. Public opinion began to turn against solitary confinement and forced labor, and a new era of reform, one focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment, began to take shape. Yet, despite these changes, Port Arthur remained a dark reminder of the past. Today, Port Arthur stands as a memorial to Australia's colonial history, a place where visitors can walk through the ruins, see the old watchtowers, and learn about the lives of the men who were sent there. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage listed destination, attracting tourists from around the globe who come to learn about the history of the British Empire's penal colonies. But for some, the history of Port Arthur isn't something to be admired, it's something to be feared. The ghosts of Port Arthur are not just the phantoms of old prisoners, but of a dark chapter in Australia's history. Even now, the island's shadow looms over the country's modern-day approach to criminal justice. The stories of suffering and isolation that took place here are still deeply relevant, serving as a constant reminder of the cost of empire, and the psychological toll exacted by systems of control and punishment. For those who visit Port Arthur, it's not just the ruins that leave an impression, it's the unspoken truth behind the walls. The silence that still lingers in the air, the echoes of lives destroyed, and the haunting specter of the men who never truly left. And for those who lived through it, the survivors, the broken souls, Port Arthur will forever be a place of deep wounds, scars that no amount of time or restoration could ever fully heal. The story of Port Arthur does not end with its closure in 1877, nor with its transformation into a tourist attraction in the 20th century. The prison, built on the ideals of colonial punishment, became more than just a historical footnote. It laid the groundwork for an entire system of incarceration that would shape Australia's approach to justice for generations. Before Port Arthur, the British Empire's practice of penal transportation had already deeply embedded the idea that punishment could not only be physical but psychological. The idea of reforming criminals through isolation, forced labor, and silence had long been a cornerstone of British penal philosophy. But at Port Arthur, that philosophy was pushed to its cruelest extremes. This legacy did not simply vanish with the closure of the prison. It lived on in the penal systems that followed, leaving a shadow that continues to shape modern Australian correctional practices. In the decades that followed the closure of Port Arthur, Australia's justice system slowly evolved. However, the scars of colonial punishment were never fully erased. The practices of solitary confinement, hard labor, and isolation continue to be utilized in various forms throughout the country's prison system. These methods, inspired by the dark legacy of Port Arthur, influenced not only Australia but the Western world's broader approach to incarceration. In the early 20th century, as Australia began to establish its own identity apart from British colonial rule, A new generation of thinkers and reformers began to push for a more humane approach to criminal justice. The belief that prisoners could be reformed through punishment started to lose favor. Instead, the focus began to shift towards rehabilitation, an attempt to reintegrate prisoners into society rather than break their spirits completely. But while these ideas gained traction in the mid-1900s, they were far from universally accepted. The penal system, built on the foundation of places like Port Arthur, was resistant to change. For many, the idea of mercy and rehabilitation seemed weak compared to the age-old belief that harsh punishment could serve as both a deterrent and a means of control. This clash between rehabilitation and punishment played out in the design of Australia's prison systems in the 20th century. As new correctional facilities were built, many continued to reflect the ideas established in Port Arthur: harsh conditions, forced labor, and a focus on isolation rather than integration. In fact, the implementation of solitary confinement, used at Port Arthur to break the will of the prisoner, continued in Australian prisons well into the late 20th century. Though the brutal methods of the past were somewhat modified, the fundamental idea of breaking down prisoners remained firmly entrenched. The 1970s and 1980s saw a surge in prisoners' rights activism, with organizations calling for a re-evaluation of the treatment of prisoners. Reports of mistreatment in prisons and the psychological damage caused by isolation began to raise questions about the effectiveness of the penal system. Scholars and human rights advocates began pointing out that the system, rather than reforming individuals, was simply breeding more violence, both inside and outside of prison walls. Yet, despite mounting pressure for reform, solitary confinement and brutal physical punishments remained common in Australian prisons, reflecting the deep-rooted influence of the past. It wasn't until the 1990s that Australia began to make a concerted effort to change its prison system. New programs focused on education, job training, and mental health treatment were introduced, and the emphasis shifted towards rehabilitation rather than retribution. But even as the country began to move toward more progressive policies, the legacy of places like Port Arthur continued to echo in its correctional facilities. The prison industrial complex, which had grown alongside Australia's own, still relied on some of the same practices that were first pioneered in colonial penal systems. Practices that prioritized control, punishment, and fear over humanity, and over the notion that people could change. Today, many Australian prisons have adopted modern rehabilitation techniques, but the echoes of Port Arthur are hard to escape. Solitary confinement, for example, is still used in Australian prisons, though with a greater understanding of its psychological effects. Many activists argue that even the use of solitary confinement for brief periods or long stretches remains a harmful and outdated practice. Despite reforms, the psychological damage caused by isolation, the very type that convicts faced in Port Arthur, is still evident in today's system. As the country continues to grapple with the legacy of its colonial past, the connection between places like Port Arthur and modern incarceration cannot be ignored. The men who once languished in the dark cells of Port Arthur, and the millions more who followed in their footsteps across the centuries, are part of a story that stretches beyond just one prison. It is the story of a system designed to oppress, control, and break the spirit of those who came under its watch. In recent years, the conversation surrounding prison reform has shifted to focus not only on rehabilitation but also on the impact of mass incarceration, the racial disparities in sentencing, and the overcrowding of Australian jails. These modern issues, while far removed from the days of Port Arthur, still reflect some of the same fundamental problems that began in the colonial penal system. A reliance on punishment over understanding, and the treating of human beings as tools for maintaining control rather than as individuals in need of care, reform, and respect. Port Arthur may have been closed more than a century ago, but its effects are still felt today, in the design of Australia's modern prisons, in the policies that govern them, and in the lingering psychological scars carried by former prisoners who survived the torment of isolation and forced labor. Even as the country has moved toward a more rehabilitative approach, the shadow of Port Arthur remains a constant reminder of the costs of empire, the failures of the penal system, and the enduring battle between punishment and redemption. As Australia moved into the 21st century, the nation's approach to criminal justice began to shift significantly. The once cruel methods employed in places like Port Arthur gradually gave way to more rehabilitative policies, focusing on education, reintegration, and treatment. Yet, as the country grappled with these changes, the shadow of Port Arthur remained, quietly influencing public opinion and government policy. Port Arthur's legacy was not only felt in the penal system but also in the way the Australian public viewed crime and punishment. The stories of convicts suffering in isolation for petty crimes, the psychological toll of silence, and the brutal punishment meted out to those who dared defy authority remained etched in the collective memory of the nation. Even as reforms were introduced, the idea that punishment needed to be harsh and unyielding was hard to shake. One of the ways Port Arthur's influence persisted was in the public sphere of what was seen as a breakdown in social order. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, there was an ongoing debate in Australia about the balance between rehabilitation and punishment. High-profile cases of violent crime, particularly those involving repeat offenders, stirred fears that the penal system had become too lenient. Many Australians, still haunted by the brutal discipline of colonial prisons, felt uneasy about shifting away from strict punitive measures. The Australian media played a significant role in perpetuating these fears. Sensationalist crime reports often emphasized the need for tougher sentences, higher security prisons, and the return of harsher punishment for criminals. These narratives, echoing the punitive ethos of Port Arthur, created a public perception that punishment, severe, isolating, and unforgiving, was still the answer to crime. In this context, the prison reform movement faced significant opposition, even as the harmful effects of the old system became increasingly clear. However, as the years passed, there was a growing understanding within Australia that the legacy of places like Port Arthur had deep psychological consequences. Studies began to show the long-term effects of solitary confinement and isolation on mental health, pushing the nation toward rethinking how prisons should function. Australia's approach to corrections slowly shifted away from punishment for punishment's sake and toward a more nuanced understanding of criminal justice, one that included a focus on rehabilitation, mental health support, and community reintegration. Yet, as Australia worked to reform its prisons, it couldn't escape the reality that the prison system was still deeply embedded in the culture of control and authority established during the colonial era. Port Arthur had created a blueprint for incarceration that prioritized silence, separation, and isolation, values that continued to shape the design of modern facilities. While solitary confinement has been reduced in many places, the concept of separating the bad from society, of isolating criminals, remained deeply ingrained in the public consciousness. In more recent years, the debate around solitary confinement has reached new heights. Human rights advocates continue to speak out against the use of isolation in Australian prisons, drawing direct parallels between the suffering of prisoners in the 19th century and the mental health crises facing inmates today. The legacy of Port Arthur, where isolation was used not just as punishment but as a tool to strip away identity and humanity, remains an uncomfortable truth that Australia cannot ignore. This ongoing struggle reflects the lasting impact of colonial institutions on modern governance and justice systems. While the penal system has evolved, its roots remain firmly planted in the past. Port Arthur, for all its historical significance as a tool of punishment, continues to act as a mirror to Australia's modern corrections system, a reminder of the damage that can be caused when justice is defined by cruelty and control rather than rehabilitation and care. The prison itself, now a popular tourist site, tells the story of a dark chapter in Australia's history. Visitors to the site come from all over the world to walk through the crumbling ruins, to see the infamous Convicts Church, and to feel the haunting presence of a place that once housed thousands of men, many of whom left in worse shape than when they arrived. The eerie feeling that many report when visiting Port Arthur is not just the weight of the past, it is the lingering spirit of a system that tried to break the human soul. Port Arthur is no longer a place of punishment, but its shadow still looms large over the landscape of Australia's penal history. The prison that was designed to break men, to isolate them, to silence them, to strip them of their very humanity, has become an enduring symbol of the cost of empire and the failure of an entire system of justice. Today we look at the ruins and see history. But for those who lived through its horrors, it was more than history, it was a living nightmare. The scars of Port Arthur are not just buried in the past, they are alive in the stories of those who survived, in the mental toll borne by generations of prisoners, and in the ongoing conversations about how we treat those who break the law. As Australia continues to reform its penal system, the lessons of Port Arthur should never be forgotten. Because in the quiet ruins of that once feared prison lies the most important lesson of all, that no matter how hard a system tries to break the human spirit, it will never fully succeed. And as long as we remember the suffering that took place there, we can continue to strive for a justice system that seeks to heal rather than harm, to rehabilitate rather than isolate. So, as we close the chapter on Port Arthur, let us remember the price of punishment, and the cost of ignoring the humanity of those who have fallen through the cracks. Because justice, true justice, is built on the foundation of compassion, not cruelty. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the darkest chapters in Australia's history. If you found this story as haunting and eye-opening as we did, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries that delve deep into the world of criminal justice. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never forget the stories that history tried to bury.